Well, good morning. Welcome. Congratulations, you've chosen the history class as your elective this morning. Hope you don't regret that. My name is Daniel Coffman. It's my privilege to spend 3 weeks with you talking about a subject that, when I was originally asked to do one of these, appealed to me as something that I didn't know a whole lot about, and that is, what is some of the history of the Christian church post-New Testament? And how did it go from this ignored and then persecuted religious minority to being one of the most dominant religions of the ancient world? So today we're going to get started with my new class here at Roma Invicta. And before we begin, how about we start with a word of prayer, and then we'll get started. Father in heaven, thank you for this morning, for this time that we can spend together studying, Lord, the history of your church and how you have moved in the past, working in the lives of people across time. Lord, thank you for the way that you have preserved your word for us. Lord, give me wisdom as I teach this morning. In Jesus' name, amen. You know, one of my favorite passages in the Old Testament comes from the book of Daniel. By the way, there are handouts coming around. I hope there's enough. In future weeks, I'll have a stack of them on the table up here at the front, so feel free to come grab one. In Daniel chapter 7, there's an interesting vision that the prophet Daniel has, and according to most biblical scholars, he's having a vision of future empires, and many of you probably know this passage. It reads like this. Daniel said, "In my vision, at night I looked, and there before me were 4 great winds of heaven churning up the great sea. 4 great beasts, each different from the others, came up out of the sea. The first was like a lion, and it had the wings of an eagle. I watched until its wings were torn off, and it was lifted from the ground so that it stood on 2 feet like a human being, and the mind of a human was given to it." Many scholars believe that this is a reference to the Babylonian Empire. Next is the next beast. "And there before me was a second beast, which looked like a bear. It was raised up on one of its sides, and it had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. It was told, 'Get up and eat your fill of flesh.'" And many believe that this is a reference to the Persian Empire, which would come afterwards. "And then, after that, I looked, and there before me was another beast, one that looked like a leopard, and was on its back. It had 4 wings like those of a bird. This beast had 4 heads, and it was given authority to rule." The idea being it was very fast, and then later it became 4 different successors, or 4 different parts. And many believe this is a reference to the Greeks, specifically Alexander the Great, who very quickly conquered much of the ancient world. And then after his rather untimely demise, his kingdom, his empire split into multiple different parts, led by his generals. And then there's the last beast, which is different than all the others. "And after that, in my vision at night, I looked, and there before me was a 4th beast, terrifying and frightening, and very powerful. It had large iron teeth. It crushed and devoured its victims and trampled underfoot whatever was left. It was different from all the former beasts, and it had 10 horns." And many believe that this is a reference to the Romans, who would kind of be the capstone of all of these successive ancient empires, one after another. And truly, the Roman Empire is something that affects us greatly, even in America today. It was an enormous civilization spanning most of the Mediterranean world at that time. And even after its fall, many civilizations have tried to be like the new Roman Empire. Everyone wants to be the new Rome. In the year 800, the Frankish king Charlemagne would have himself crowned by the Pope in Rome on Christmas Day in the year 800. And the Pope crowned him Holy Roman Emperor. Ironically, since he ruled over a Germanic tribe that had actually assisted in the downfall of the Roman Empire centuries before, but now he wanted to be the new Roman emperor, which was also doubly ironic since the eastern half of the Roman Empire was still in existence at the time, but it was being ruled by a woman at that moment, so the Pope thought that was grounds enough to a loophole to crown a man emperor in the West. Even after the fall of Constantinople in 1453, future civilizations continued to want to be the new Rome. The Ottoman Turks, who were the ones who destroyed the last remnants of the Roman Empire, themselves decided they were now the new Roman Empire. Perhaps the most famous Turkish king Sultan was Suleiman the Magnificent, and he believed he was a new Caesar, and that gave him the right to invade Western Europe and create an Islamic version of the Roman Empire. When Constantinople fell, the next largest Orthodox Christian church in Europe was Moscow, and so the Russians proclaimed their city as the third Rome, and that they are the successors to the Roman Empire. Even more recently, Napoleon Bonaparte believed he was a successor to Caesar, and he made a lot of use of Roman iconography in his propaganda and the eagle standards that he gave to his marshals. And then probably the last example of someone seriously trying to portray themselves as a successor to Rome was the hapless Benito Mussolini, who believed that he was a new Caesar and that he was going to create a new Roman Empire, and his imitation was probably the worst, and the weakest of all of them. But even here in America, we're impacted by Rome. In our language, although not directly descended from Latin, we use plenty of words based on Latin. Our government, we even use words like Senate and Senator and Republic and all these kinds of words that we borrow from Rome. Our architecture as well is influenced by the Romans. And even Abe Lincoln sits with his hands resting on two bundles of wood with an axe head inside of them called a fasces, which is a symbol of Roman authority and power. And these also sit behind the Speaker of the House's chair on Capitol Hill. Last year, on a lighter note, there was even maybe some of you are aware of this, there was a social media trend that briefly went viral, is the word I'm looking for, as they often do. And the trend was for women to ask their husbands and boyfriends, how often do you think about the Roman Empire? And they were shocked, many of them, by the answer was, a few times a month, once a week, some of them every day, or multiple times a day. And this was like a revelation that people would, that men especially would do this. And so now all of you can now be part of that trend because you've thought about it now today. So what are we going to do in this class? Well, I have three main objectives, as you can see in your handout. First of all, what we're doing mostly today is kind of building our foundation of Roman history and refreshing our knowledge of it so that we can then move on further into Christian history in the next 2 weeks. We're also going to explore the conflict between the pagan culture of Rome and that of the young early church. And then finally, follow the events that are quite incredible that led to a complete 180 of the Roman Empire's treatment of Christianity from being persecuted and repeatedly attempted extermination to becoming the state religion of the most powerful civilization at that time. Now, Roman history can be divided into multiple different eras of history. If you go really far back in Roman history, they were originally a monarchy, a kingdom, and sometimes referred to as the Roman kingdom, although the amount of historical knowledge available, sources available of this time period is pretty sparse. Some of these kings were probably not even Roman, but foreign. Then there's the more famous Roman Republic that was founded in 509 BC, and then that gave way to the empire following a series of civil wars, which we'll talk about later. Now, even that's not necessarily the best way to delineate Roman history. As many of you know, the Roman Empire itself split into multiple parts, and then on purpose, it was split into two parts in the 5th century, and was divided into the Western and Eastern Roman Empire. And so you can even divide Roman history that way too, that the West fell much earlier, and the East kept on going all the way until 1453. I tell my history students, it's crazy to think about that just a few decades before Christopher Columbus discovered the New World, there were still people who living at that time who believed that they were the Roman Empire. We often think of the Roman Empire as being really far back, but in some ways it lasted a lot longer, depending on how you measure that. So let's begin with some early Roman history. Many of you are probably familiar with the fact that Rome's mythical founding revolves around two brothers. Do you know their names? Romulus and Remus, right? And that they were abandoned at birth, raised by wolves, which is why if you ever go to visit Rome, you'll see this all over the place, is two babies suckling at a she-wolf. And somehow they still ended up growing up to be normal human beings. I don't think that's how that works. I'm not an expert, but I don't think being raised by wild animals. Anyways, and this supposedly happened in 753 BC or thereabouts. The story is that the brothers feuded over what they would call the city, and Romulus wanted to name it after himself, and so he killed his brother Remus, and that's how the city got its name. Eventually, the Romans overthrew their monarch, probably a foreign monarch, and established the Roman Republic. The Roman Republic centered around an elected Senate, and this republic was dominated by the Senate and its ruling class. We use the word democracy or election kind of loosely here. It's not necessarily what we would consider to be acceptably democratic. The Senate was dominated by really a select group of families called the patrician class, and you had to be part of that social class in order to even be considered for election into the Senate. And so it was very much an aristocratic kind of republic. The people of Rome referred to their nation as the Senate and the people of Rome, which can be abbreviated in Latin as SPQR. And so if you ever see that emblem, that's what that means. It's kind of like saying the United States of America, but in this case, the Senate and the people of Rome. And I remember when I had the privilege of visiting Rome when I was in college, I was shocked as I walked around the city by many things, but one was to look down at manhole covers and see the emblem just all over the place there in Rome. That's not been there since the Roman Empire. That's a more recent addition. So after Rome became a republic and freed itself from its foreign rulers, it gradually, as we all know, expanded its territory, as all empires are apt to do, and the Roman Empire being probably the best example. In 275 BC, the Romans, after a series of wars with their fellow Latins around them, were able to secure most of the Italian peninsula by defeating the Greeks. They defeated a Greek general named Pyrrhus, who was from the Greek city of Epirus. And the Romans defeated him mostly just by not giving up. In fact, Pyrrhus won numerous victories over the Romans, but discovered, as many civilizations will in the future discover, that the Romans didn't give up very easily. If you've ever heard the term a Pyrrhic victory, which means you've won something, but at such a high cost it's not worth it anymore, this supposedly comes from Pyrrhus, who defeated the Romans but lost so many men that he ended up having to abandon Italy, and because he said something like, "One more victory like this and I shall be undone." After Rome secured control of the Italian peninsula, that brought it into conflict with the other rising superpower of the Mediterranean, which was Carthage, which up until that time had been a Roman ally but became its nemesis. Carthage, located in modern-day Tunisia, was a coastal city, very mercantile, and in a lot of ways the opposite of Rome culturally. And Rome and Carthage fought a series of wars against one another known as the Punic Wars. And the word Punic comes from the Roman pronunciation of Phoenician, which apparently came out as something like Punician, and therefore they are called the Punic Wars, mostly because Rome won them. In fact, Rome won these wars so completely that Carthage ceased to exist. The Romans destroyed the city, and it never threatened their power again. And that made them the dominant power in the Western Mediterranean. After that, the Romans turned east, and the Carthaginians had been helped by the Greeks. And by this time, this is, of course, long after the death of Alexander the Great, and his successor kingdoms, who are called the Diadochi, or the successors, ruling various Greek kingdoms in the east, came into conflict with the Romans. The Romans fought a series of wars against them, and after defeating each of these Greek kingdoms, that made them the dominant power in the eastern Mediterranean. And for our purposes, more importantly, gave them influence over what was formerly known as the Kingdom of Israel. So that was a lot of time, just kind of like very quickly summarized. And by the end of all those wars, the Roman Republic looks something like this. It's a conglomeration of territories. Some ruled directly by Rome, some ruled as client states, but it is clearly a superpower on the rise. But even after all this success, Rome has problems, as many superpowers have, is that once they reach the pinnacle or the zenith of their power, there are significant weaknesses that come to light that are either going to destroy that superpower or force it to change in a lot of different ways. So that leads us then to the Republic's fall. By the end of the 2nd century, Rome faced a number of serious internal challenges that it was not really prepared for. Roman society at the time was centered around an agrarian life, that only citizens served in the military, and citizens provided their own equipment, and they were meant to just fight short wars. You know, you go off and fight for a season and then come home, and the Punic Wars in particular had been years and years of constant fighting, and this was a drain on Rome's economy. It was also especially bad for the average Roman citizen who would go to war, which means that he's not farming his land, and he would still owe taxes on his land for all the years that he wasn't there fighting for the state. And many of them would go bankrupt when they came back and have to sell off their land for dirt cheap. They would end up selling it to the aristocrats, to the patricians who had sent them to war in the first place, and then the patricians would staff those new, larger plantations with slaves won from the wars that the citizens had fought and bled and died for in the first place. And you can imagine the discontent that that would create. Rome also had a large territory to defend all of a sudden, and that's expensive, and you need lots of soldiers. But if only citizens are allowed in the military who are wealthy enough to supply their own equipment, and they're all going bankrupt and selling off their land and becoming urban poor masses, there's no pool of recruitment to draw from. And so that leads to declining military strength at the same time. And this class friction in Rome was becoming worse and worse. And so the people began to turn to heroes who would change society, make things better, even if that didn't happen through the normal legal means that the state normally operated by. In the year 107, there was a general named Gaius Marius, who was a relative of a young Julius Caesar, and he decided to reform the whole way the Roman Empire, Republic at this point still, did its military. And he abolished the idea of citizen soldiers who had to pay for their own equipment and had to come from the middle class or higher. And instead, he opened up his legions to anyone who wanted to serve, and he would pay their salaries, he would pay for their equipment personally as their general. And on top of that, he made military service a career. It wasn't something that you would just do for a while and then go home. It would be something that you could do permanently. And so now Rome has permanent armies that are operational year-round, and they're paid and supplied and therefore loyal to, not the Senate, but to the general who created their legion. And on top of that, the icing on the cake was, if you were a non-Roman citizen, which was a lot of people in the Roman Republic, even if you were born in Italy, that was not guaranteed that you were a Roman citizen. If you served in one of his legions for 20 years, you would get full citizenship and a land grant at the end of your retirement. That's a pretty sweet deal for a lot of men, and they took him up on that. During this time, the Roman military is also reorganized as far as its structure goes, and I thought you might enjoy a quick illustration of what that would look like and how Roman legions were structured and organized. So I'm going to show you a quick video describing that.
There are two main types of soldier. A legionary is a Roman citizen, an auxiliary is not. Each must supply his own equipment and swear an oath of loyalty to the emperor. Legionaries join an infantry unit as part of a group of 8 men, a contubernium, who all share sleeping quarters. New soldiers are stuck with fatigues, dirty jobs, until they secure a specialist post. 10 contubernia form a century, with its own standard bearer, commander of the watch, second in command, and a centurion to lead them all. 6 centuries together make up a cohort, and 10 cohorts, plus a small cavalry unit, the Equites Legionis, make up the biggest Roman army unit of them all, the legion. The legion's symbol is the Roman eagle, borne aloft by the aquilifer. Cohorts in a legion are numbered 1 to 10. Cohort 1 is extra large with 5 double centuries. Its centurions are the senior-ranking primi ordines, and the most senior of all is primus pilus, or first file. He can be promoted to be praefectus castrorum, camp prefect, in charge of the daily running of the legion. Outranking this camp prefect are 7 men, 6 staff officers, the tribuni, and the commander of the entire legion, the legatus. Back in Rome, he's a member of the Senate, the empire's 600-strong ruling elite. But in the field, he commands his legion of some 6,000 troops, each a Roman citizen. But while these citizen legionaries are the backbone of the Roman army, the non-Roman citizens, the auxiliaries, are the specialists. In auxiliary cohorts, men recruited across the empire use their talents and abilities in the service of Rome. One area of expertise was horsemanship. There are cavalry-only regiments, the ala, a few double-strength cavalry regiments, including one in Britain, the ala Petriana, also part-mounted cohorts, and some auxiliary cohorts are just regular infantry, organized like the legionary cohorts. But the similarities stop here, at the cohort. Auxiliaries are part of no bigger unit. There's no legion and no legate to command them. Instead, each cohort has its own high-ranking commander, who leads these more compact, maneuverable units. And when an auxiliary soldier has served the Roman army for 25 years, a great reward awaits. He gets a plot of land, a pension, and all of the rights of a Roman citizen, for him, his children, and the generations to come.
You mentioned a retirement of 25 years. I think my note said 20. That number changed depending on which specific time period you were looking at and who was emperor and who they were trying to bribe into military service at that particular moment. So anyways, with that system in place. Oh, one thing I was going to mention before I moved on. If you're like me, you may be wondering, I thought a century meant 100, and yet their official military code is a century is 80. Actually, which is a little disappointing, like they would line up that way or not. But probably, if you included the centurion's slaves, his servants, and other officers, it probably actually did equal about 100 men. Well, like I hinted at earlier, Rome's problems were becoming irreconcilable. And by the 1st century BC, Rome was rocked by a series of civil wars, at least 3 major civil wars, that essentially destroyed the Republic and transformed it into what we would call the Roman Empire that came afterwards. And essentially, these took place because, one, the military was becoming more and more loyal to specific generals than it was to the state, and the average citizen wasn't loyal to the state anyways because the state wasn't seeing to their needs and wasn't fairly treating them anyways. Probably the best known of these civil wars involved Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar, when he was a young man, was actually almost, his life was in danger when he was young during the first civil war because his family had been on the losing side of a civil war. It was actually the guy I mentioned earlier, Gaius Marius, who lost to another Roman general named Sulla. And it was just kind of the way things were done in those days is that the side that won the civil war would then purge the supporters of the other side. They were called proscriptions. And sounds not that menacing, but it means people to be murdered. And Julius Caesar's name was on one of those lists, and he ended up, through some timely political connections, and the fact that he was young at the time, was able to escape that. Later, of course, he ends up becoming a general, and he leads his legions illegally, he wasn't supposed to do this, into Gaul, or what is today France. Won lots of glory, more importantly, won the loyalty of the legions that he was assigned, and then came back to Rome and overthrew the government, installed himself in, and then he got, of course, as you all know, Julius Caesar, ironically, when he took power, decided he would be different than his predecessors and didn't murder lots of people who had opposed him when he came to power. Seems like the progressive, nice thing to do, and then those very same people literally stabbed him in the back and actually stabbed him all over and killed him. Then his adopted son, nephew, Gaius Octavius, then fought in the Third Civil War and consolidated power afterwards, after defeating his uncle's former right-hand man, Mark Antony, and his girlfriend, Cleopatra, from Egypt. Now, Octavius was, the benefactor of many of these problems that Rome had. After he took power, he didn't try to necessarily reestablish Rome as it was. Instead, he was immensely popular and took on a number of titles that signaled that Rome was shifting away from where it had been before. For instance, he took on the title Princeps Civitatis, the first citizen, which is kind of like a way of saying, I'm not king, but I am more important than all the rest of you. But I'm still citizen, you know. The French did this when they had their revolution, you know, where they got rid of titles like sir and ma'am, and they just called everyone citizen, but like the leaders of the government were like first citizen. It's dumb. Then he also had a religious title, Augustus. That's probably a title, a name that you know him best as. That's actually a reflection of his supposed divinity. It means exalted one. And he is considered to be the first imperator or emperor of Rome. Although he didn't necessarily try to draw attention to that fact, he kept the Senate in place. He had it go through its normal motions as it always did and tried to preserve the facade that the Roman Republic was still going to keep the peace, but he also had a pretty firm grip on power. And the average Roman was okay with this because after all the years of chaos and destruction from the civil wars, they were really just ready for someone to take control of the government and fix all their problems. I tell my students often, those are dangerous moments in history when there are severe problems in society and someone stands up and says, hey, if you give me all the power, I will fix all of our problems and everything will be fine. Sometimes that works out. It did for the Romans, but as we all know, even from more recent history, it more often than not doesn't. And Octavius, or Augustus, was the emperor when Jesus Christ was born. We know this from Luke 2, which tells us, and it came to pass in those days that there went out a decree from Caesar Augustus that the world should be taxed. Caesar ruled he took on the name of his adopted father and became a Caesar. And then, of course, that name became so ingrained in the mind of the Roman civilization that the word Caesar became the name of the ruler. And we still use it even in our society, even today, as our term for emperor. Other societies will do the same. The Russians will use it to make their term czar. The Germans will use it to make their term Kaiser, and et cetera, and et cetera. Augustus also ruled over an immediate change in the climate of Rome in the sense that his rule and the next several emperors who came after him was a peaceful time for Rome, generally, internally peaceful. They were still fighting wars of conquest and stuff on the periphery, but internally things were peaceful and prosperous. A time in Roman history known as the Pax Romana, or the Roman peace is what that term means. And which means that there's just one dominant civilization that rules, and therefore things are fairly controlled and peaceful at home. And that term gets used for other civilizations who are in a similar position, like in the 19th century, the Pax Britannica, for instance. Or as many people have described the post-World War II era we live in now as the Pax Americana. Is that still an accurate description of the world? I'm not so sure that it is anymore, but it was at one point. We also know that this is the time that Jesus was born, right when Octavius was emperor. It was towards the end of his life, not only because the Bible tells us, but even secular historians at the time tell us. Josephus tells us, about this time there lived Jesus, a wise man, if indeed one ought to call him a man, for he was one who wrought surprising feats and was a teacher of such people as accept the truth gladly. Now, Josephus wasn't a believer. He was actually Jewish by heritage, but had been Romanized and wrote for the Roman government. But he's telling us about his perspective of Jesus. He goes on to say, he won over many Jews and many Greeks. He was the Messiah. When Pilate, upon hearing him accused by men of the highest standing among us, had condemned him to be crucified, those who had in the first place come to love him did not cease. On the third day, he appeared to them restored to life, for the prophets of God had prophesied these things and countless other marvelous things about him. And the tribe of Christians, so called after him, has still to this day not disappeared. So what about Rome and Israel then? What is their relationship? I touched on this briefly last summer, if you came to my class on the history of Israel. But it's actually during this chaotic time of civil war that Roman influence first comes to Israel after defeating the Greeks. In the year 63 BC, Roman influence began when the Roman general Pompey, who later became a rival of Caesar's, Julius Caesar that is, invaded Israel and intervened in the internal politics of the region. He decided to back one of the sides in this time of civil unrest in Israel and established a client state, and that would be ruled over Herod. And for a time, Rome ruled Israel indirectly. The Romans often preferred to do this, if they could actually, is not rule territory that they conquered directly unless it has special strategic significance or it's a threat to the security of Rome or something like that. It's closer to home, but Israel's so far away, there's no need for them to rule it directly, so they prefer to rule through puppet rulers. That's cheaper and easier to do than to rule it directly. Now, generally speaking, Romans looked down on Jews as a culture for a few different reasons. We know this in part because the Roman poet Juvenal tells us in, I think, kind of a humorous way. Describing Jews, he says this: "Some, whose lot it was to have Sabbath-fearing fathers, worship nothing but clouds and the numen of the heavens, and think it as great a crime to eat pork, from which their parents abstained, as it is to eat human flesh." So he's talking about, obviously, the dietary restrictions, and the fact that he's saying they worship nothing but clouds is in reference to they don't worship idols. They don't worship, like something physical, whereas the Romans would be very much into idols and physical representations of their gods. He goes on to say, they get themselves circumcised and look down on Roman law, preferring instead to learn and honor and fear the Jewish commandments, whatever was handed down by Moses in that arcane tome of his. They make every seventh day taboo for all life's business, dedicated to idleness. Isn't it amazing that a guy like Juvenal, who lived, 2,000 years ago, already considered the books of Moses to be old. They were old to him, and they couldn't understand the idea of the Sabbath and resting on it. And he concludes, even when Jerusalem was still standing, because he's writing after the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, and the Jews at peace with us, the demands of their religion were incompatible with the majesty of our empire, the dignity of our name, and the institutions of our ancestors. So what was it then that was so intolerable about them? Well, the Romans really, really didn't like the idea of monotheism. They disliked the idea of monotheism. They often didn't believe in anything that was supernatural that could be observed. But they tolerated Judaism at first because it was ancient. And the Romans loved old stuff. Ironically, Romans loved history. So we who love history love studying the Romans. The Romans loved history too. And so whenever the Romans would come across an old civilization, if that civilization had existed for a long time and had traditions that went back a long, long, long ways, they would be really fascinated by that, and they would not destroy it usually, but try to incorporate it into their own religious structure. For instance, they had this experience when they went into Egypt, and the Romans thought Egypt was like just a gold mine of culture. And for Israel and the Jews, it was like, okay, the temple, that's pretty cool. The priests and the garments and the sacrifices and all the Romans loved the traditions and the dignity of it. And so that kind of stayed their hand and forced them to tolerate Judaism. In fact, it became law. Augustus issued a decree saying, "It has been decided by me and my council," he means really him, "under oath, with the consent of the Roman people, that the Jews may follow their own customs in accordance with the laws of their fathers." So it was actually originally law that they were permitted to do their own thing, and they weren't to be persecuted or harassed for it. It really did help that the Jews did not attempt to convert Romans to their religion. The fact that the Jews were content to just kind of stay in their own bubble meant that they were never considered a cultural threat to Rome in that way just by itself. Whereas, as we'll see next week, when Christianity comes on the scene, that's way different because the Christians don't just stay cloistered in their own little bubble, but they end up just reaching out to everyone of any class and any culture. And then all of a sudden you got people converting, rich people, poor people, and that really, kind of threw a wrench in the system for the Romans. Eventually, Herod's dynasty fell apart, and the Jews launched a series of revolts. Again, I went into the detail about this last summer, against Roman rule. And these were very bloody, very destructive conflicts, ultimately crushed by the Romans. After this, the client state that had ruled over Israel was abolished, and the Romans incorporated Israel into their empire. They renamed it. They started heavily emphasizing the term Palestine or Palestina at the time, and they even renamed the city of Jerusalem, what was left of it, and that became part of the empire. But this all happened, post-New Testament. Jesus, of course, predicted that this would happen when he said that while he was in Jerusalem that there would be no stone of the temple left on top of another. And this came to pass in 70 AD. And again, Josephus tells us what happened when the Romans finally were able to crush the Jewish rebellion by storming the city of Jerusalem. He says, the Romans, now masters of the wall, planted their standards on the towers. Pouring into the alleys, sword in hand, they massacred indiscriminately all whom they met, and burnt the houses with all who had taken refuge within. They choked the alleys with corpses and deluged the whole city in blood, insomuch that many of the fires were extinguished by the gory stream. Caesar, now this is the Roman general Titus, actually at the time. His father was emperor at the time, Vespasian, and he himself would be future emperor, and so that's why he's being referred to as Caesar at the moment. Caesar ordered the whole city and the temple to be razed to the ground, leaving only the loftiest of the towers and the portion of the wall enclosing the city on the west. All the rest of the wall encompassing the city was so completely leveled to the ground as to leave future visitors to the spot no ground for believing that it had ever been inhabited. Such was the end to which the frenzy of revolutionaries brought Jerusalem, that splendid city of worldwide renown. It's estimated that somewhere in the neighborhood of 1 million or more Jews died during this series of revolts against Rome. In fact, if you go to Rome today, you will see a triumphal arch there, not far from the Colosseum, that has depictions of the Roman soldiers entering Jerusalem and carrying off its spoils. Probably most famously, this image here of menorah being carried off. And so that's the situation we find ourselves in as the Christian church is emerging inside the Roman Empire. The empire has gone through its republic phase, through a series of destructive civil wars, turned into a more autocratic imperial rule, and then its relationship with Israel itself, where Christianity came from. And in the minds of many Romans, Christianity and Judaism are essentially the same thing, to them at first at least. This is how they view it, and this is their experience with it. Next week and the week after, I'm excited to go into more detail about the Christian church and the persecution, incredible persecution that many of them suffered through, and then an eventual turnaround where Christianity became accepted and even adopted as an official religion, which you would think then would lead to a wonderful time of spiritual revival, but as is often the case, mankind tends to get in the way of those kinds of things. So thank you for joining me. I'm going to conclude there, and I'll close us in a word of prayer. Father, thank you for this morning and for your word and for the history that we can learn about your actions, Lord, and how you have led your church and built it up